There, I'm Tina Cortez, acting chair of the School of Media here at Seneca Polytechnic, and this is In Conversation, an opportunity for students and faculty to engage and learn and lead. Every month, we focus on the stories and the people, and we allow the conversation to guide and inform and inspire us. This month, this Earth Month, our focus is on the environment, sustainability, and climate change. Within Conversation, over to School of Media professor Robert Ballantyne.
Welcome to the April 2023 edition of In Conversation. I'm Professor Robert Ballantyne, the School of Media at Seneca Polytechnic. In my journalism courses, the Canadian Press Stylebook is required reading. This book sets the standards for reporters across Canada. It offers a foundational text on how to cover lots of different issues like the COVID pandemic, race and ethnicity, and climate change. Here's what the section on climate change starts with. Few areas of public policy have followed a more interesting and politically fraught evolutionary path than the question of how human endeavor is impacting the world's climate. The title of former US Vice President Al Gore's seminal 2006 documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, captures the inherent tensions nicely. The once fierce battle about the existence of climate change has largely given way to more nuanced, but no less urgent debates over acceptable levels of greenhouse gas emissions, the economic impacts of carbon pricing, and the long-term sustainability of fossil fuels. Even so, public understanding of the nature, the science, and the technology of climate change remains middling at best, and politics have muddied the waters.
So this has me wondering, is talking about climate change making it worse?
Our next guest was once a climate alarmist, but now says the entire movement is, quote, a scam.
The first real catastrophic effects of climate change will be felt by 2040.
Is there anything we can do?
Small changes to your daily routine can reduce your carbon footprint and help save the Earth.
Reduce your carbon footprint.
Cut your carbon footprint.
Stop doing things that leave a large carbon footprint.
Check out this green carbon footprint type icon here. Reminder to turn off at least half the lights.
Who planted the idea that reducing your carbon footprint is the way out of this catastrophe?
What size is your carbon footprint?
The effect that my living has on the earth in terms of the products I consume.
In a country long dependent on its natural resources, Canadians, though less divided over the truth of climate change, remain deeply conflicted about how to confront it. As part of Global News, Kamyar Razavi is telling the stories that connect Canadians to climate change. He is Global's first national climate change reporter, and he has covered everything from electric vehicles, carbon offsets, droughts, fires, floods, and more. His wide array of environmental stories brings home the effects of human activity on the planet and how we're creating long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. Hi there.
There we go.
Digital communication is still fun. Yes. I was just welcoming you to Seneca Polytechnic. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here. I appreciate it.
What did you think of that reel? It was trying to provoke some response, but certainly it's probably familiar, a lot of the stuff going on there.
Well, yeah, the carbon footprint. I mean, that is just such a classic environmental catchphrase that's problematic on so many levels. And also, I don't quite agree with talking about climate change making the problem worse. I thought that was an interesting comment. I think talking about climate change is just what we need. We can talk more about that later.
Well, we're doing it, right? So hopefully
we're doing it. That's it. Yeah.
So as I mentioned, you're the national environment and climate change journalist at Global News. But first, just as a journalist to journalist, I have to ask you, how do you cover that beat without feeling completely overwhelmed, but just day to day on what you're supposed to do next or what to cover next?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's a good question because climate change is so big. It's so complex. It's so complicated even. I mean, it touches everything. Think about it. I mean, plastic. We use plastic everywhere in our daily lives. It's in our phones. It's in our cars. It's medical equipment. But plastic comes from petrochemicals. And same for how the world gets energy to power everything. Yeah, more of it is coming from renewable energy, but a huge percentage still comes from burning fossil fuels. And so that's really the crux of climate change stories. It's understanding what climate change is about, and it boils down to a very simple thing: changing the way the world produces energy. That's the root of the problem. We've got to change the way we produce energy. We've got to stop burning stuff, which releases CO2, and using other forms of energy. So that's kind of my basis going in. Now, I know that sounds complicated and technical, but the way I try to compartmentalize that is just to look for ordinary stories. Just like we do, you said journalist to journalist, looking for stories, human stories, local stories that meet people where they're at. So I'm looking for the people, the trends, the communities that shed light on the issue and that draw context. So I want to know, who are those communities that are showing the way forward? What are the cool technologies that are making a difference? What's going to happen to real estate prices? All of these are not necessarily climate change related in the traditional sense, but have climate implications and are great local stories.
There we go.
There we go.
There we go. We're back. So I was just saying is that there is probably a tendency to drift in different directions, to being over positive potentially about solutions and also over negative. I don't know if there's such thing as a balance. I mean, it depends on what the news is, but in order to keep people's attention, is that something you're conscious of? Is the balance between problems and solutions?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's such a great question. And my entire research is about something called solutions journalism, and its role in reporting on climate. So, as I'm sure any journalism student or journalist knows, that news reporting has a pretty close relationship to conflict. We report on tension, conflict, chaos, what's going wrong in the world, different kinds of problems. I remember in journalism school, they told me that tension and conflict has to be a part of the story to make it news. But I do think there's a role for solutions information in that. That's not the same thing as saying, let's go out and just tell happy news stories and fluff pieces. Because guess what? People might say, I mean, if you talk to people on the street, they might say, yeah, the news is too negative. I don't watch it. We want more happy stories. And this has been done with focus groups. I mean, people say that, but they don't watch or click on happy news stories. If all the news was happy, not that many people would watch it. So I think there's a balance to be had. And the way I look at it is that in our stories, where we can, especially with climate, we really need to make an effort and show what's working, who is showing the way. It could be communities, it can be individual people, and really importantly, it could be government. Our job as journalists conventionally is to challenge government, right? We speak truth to power. We hold the powerful accountable. And that's really important. But we also, I think, can play a role in showing what is working, what kind of policies are having an effect and making a difference where we live. And that doesn't mean overlooking or glossing over the conflict or the chaos. I mean, let's face it, climate change is an existential threat. It's a really, really big problem. But I think we need to show people, give people a sense of who is leading the way forward, what is making a difference, and what are some of the limitations of the solution. And why is this important? Because if all we tell people is that humanity is doomed, we're all going to die, our cities are going to be underwater, then what's the point? That efficacy piece is really important. And it's not me as a journalist telling you what to do. That would be advocacy. It's not me being a cheerleader for a certain organization. I mean, that's advocacy. But it is me as a journalist showing examples and telling stories, just like I tell stories about problems, of people and communities leading the way. And that sense of efficacy is missing in a lot of climate journalism. And it's no wonder that people don't engage with this subject, because who wants to engage with something that's so scary and so such a threat to our very existence? We need examples of what's going right. And so, yeah, I do think there's a balance there.
And I think, one of the challenges too is, it was brought up earlier slightly, but that in either direction, it's kind of like, here's what's good for you and what you should be doing, and here's what's bad, and the world is going to fall apart. I think there might be, you share with me, there might be sort of a reticence on the audience part to watch these stories, whether they're even good or bad, because in one way they're either tutorials or they're doomsday scenarios. Is that true or false? That's just sort of how I feel when I see a climate story. I'm like, all right, I'm just going to brace for the news. Let's see what's going on today.
Yeah, well, I mean, this doom and gloom reporting problem has been talked about a lot. The first thing I would say is that, I mean, one of the big blind spots in climate journalism is that there just isn't enough of it. I mean, if you look at the overall news whole, which is an old term for all of the stories that get told, if you look at all of the stories that get told, the ones that are specifically about climate change make up a tiny, tiny percent. I think it's less than 2% of all US newscasts last year were climate related. So doom and gloom reporting is a problem in that it does turn people off. But I would say the bigger problem is that we just don't tell enough climate stories, period. So I just want to flag that as the first thing. And I mean, the metrics kind of speak for themselves. If you look, stories that are directly about climate change generally don't perform competitively in audience metrics compared to things about healthcare or COVID-19 vaccines or political controversies. So I think the first thing is we just need more climate stories, more climate journalism. But to kind of come back to your question, yes, doom and gloom definitely can turn people off. I mean, this is an evolutionary thing. We humans, our brains are wired to run away from threats to our existence. So we don't want to think about things that are existentially dangerous and threatening to us. So that's one of the big barriers that we have to overcome when reporting on climate. It's an existential threat, and it's not necessarily something we jump towards. There's a few other barriers to climate journalism, climate communication. I mean, if you think about it, big one is that carbon dioxide is invisible. I guarantee you, if carbon dioxide was red and smelled like rotten eggs, we would have gotten ahead of this problem. I mean, I'm sure your students aren't old enough to remember the ozone hole in the 1980s, but that was an environmental problem that had a clear visual, a hole in the ozone layer. So the world got serious about it. But climate is invisible, it's abstract, it's really scientific, it touches everything. People think that it affects distant parts of the planet, like the Arctic, or that it's, far off into the future, 2050, oh, that's so far away. These are all barriers that make climate reporting really, really difficult. And then add to that all of the political machinations and politicization of the issue. And no wonder climate is such a difficult issue to communicate.
So yes, the climate's changing, but it's cold out today, so therefore the world's not warming, right?
Yeah.
How do you deal with that kind of misinformation?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thankfully, we've moved away from a place where we need to, quote unquote, balance climate science with climate skepticism. I mean, I'm old enough to remember it wasn't that long ago, because we're taught as journalists to tell both sides of the story, right? And so I remember not long ago, maybe 10 years ago, picking up climate stories here and there and actually being told that, oh, I should go get somebody who questions whether the science is real or not. Maybe a little bit more than 10 years ago, maybe 12, 13 years ago now. And, this balance as bias, kind of, get the balance, the two sides, the believers and the skeptics. Thankfully, that doesn't happen anymore. But you're right. There's other kinds of misinformation out there, like, oh, how serious is it? Or, oh, how can climate change be real if it's -20 and out there? So I think the best antidote to that, Robert, is by providing more accurate information. Just cast sunshine on the misinformation. Because I think that factually accurate information communicated by trusted communicators goes a long way towards correcting misperceptions. And this has been tested. So one information point that's especially convincing and effective is around scientific consensus. And we have a video on this in a second. I'll cue to it. Researchers at Yale and George Mason University in Washington, D.C. found that telling people that 97% of the world's scientists think that climate change is real and caused by humans, so that's a pretty important fact. I think it's actually 98% now, had a significant impact in terms of moving people to accept that 98% of the world's scientists think that climate change is real and caused by humans. And they found that the audiences that were the most swayed by that factually accurate piece of information were Republicans, the very people who on the surface might seem the least likely to listen to the facts. And so there was a really good clip of this on John Oliver's show, and if you have it, we can play it.
Last Week Tonight presents a statistically representative climate change debate.
Good evening. Joining me tonight, a climate change denier and, naturally, Bill Nye Science Guy.
John?
Yep.
Humans are causing climate change? No question.
Wait. Before we begin, in the interest of mathematical balance, I'm going to bring out two people who agree with you, climate skeptic, and Bill Nye, I'm also going to bring out 96 other scientists. It's a little unwieldy, but this is the only way you can actually have a representative discussion. Please file in. Again, this is going to make the debate difficult. We shouldn't really be having it in the first place.
Yeah, so actually there's a little bit more to that, because then he asks the three deniers to give some reasons for why climate change is apparently fake, and they start saying, oh, well, here's why, and then he asks the other group to talk about why climate change is real, and the 97 scientists totally drown out the three other quacks. So So
there's like so much weather on TV news, and there has been for a long time. I think the Focus research says that people just love weather.
Love it. Can't go wrong with the weather story.
There's so much time probably you could build in. I know I want to move on forward to some of your stories that you reported on next, but I was curious about how would a meteorologist do that? Like, what would be their sort of nice segue? Coming up tomorrow, it's going to be sunny, but it shouldn't actually be that hot, and we're all going to die. I mean, how does that flow? Like, I'm being facetious, of course, but how would that flow?
Yeah, well, again, with climate, I always say the best climate change story is not really a climate change story. It's not your typical climate change story about melting ice caps and distant impacts. You kind of have to work the message in. And that's not that hard to do, because we're living in this theater of climate change. Everything moving forward is going to happen in the context of a warming planet. So let's say that there's a heat wave, and the TV weathercaster comes on and talks about how hot it's going to be over the next few days. Well, that's a perfect place to sneak in some messages about the health impacts of heat waves. Heat waves are among the deadliest kinds of extreme weather. So that's a great place to include some information about the deadly impacts of heat waves, or the prevalence of heat waves over the past number of years. That could be a little factoid there. Again, to get people thinking beyond the immediate weather, which is weather and meteorology, and to the climate aspect, that these are long-term trends that are having real impacts right now.
And in terms of impact, one of the stories you did that actually kind of got you on the path to being part of the climate change consortium of reporters. They're small, but you're small but mighty group across Canada and internationally, was a story about electric vehicles. So I thought we'd watch a small clip. It's a longer piece. We'll try and watch a couple of other of your stories in incomplete. But this is a news magazine feature for The New Reality, which was Global's investigative TV show.
Right.
And we'll just show a clip now of that report on electric vehicles.
Great.
The EV1 is GM's first totally electric, non-combustible fuel-on-board passenger vehicle.
A decade or two ago, consumers looked at electric vehicles, or EVs, as a curiosity. Today, they're turning heads as much for appeal as necessity, because Canadians need a spark. In fact, our love of SUVs and pickups helped raise overall emissions from transportation about 30% over the last 20 years. More EVs on the road will mean reductions in CO2, not only from transportation, but also on the main source of emissions, oil and gas production. Comparing the impact of EVs versus combustion engines is the main focus of these University of Toronto researchers. Professor Heather McLean has crunched the numbers.
We showed essentially that we'd have to have about 90% of electric vehicles in the fleet by 2050 to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement.
Postdoctoral researcher Alexandra Milovanov knows the question really is, when will Canadians turn their backs on the roar of the internal combustion engine for the hum of electric?
So I think they're getting ready. They could push harder, but I think there is also the chicken-egg problem, right? If you don't have the EVs on the road, does it make really sense to invest that much infrastructures? But if you don't have the infrastructures, does it make sense to buy an EV?
And around we go. To even buy an EV in Canada is made more difficult by the fact in 2021, 70% of dealerships don't have models on the floor. Again, it's the chicken and the egg. So how do we catch up?
Okay, and that you produced that story?
I produced it. You would have noticed that that's not my voice. I worked with reporter Mike Drolet on that story, which I produced, yes.
And so I guess it's 2021 that came out. What are the continuing perils and promises of electric vehicles? What's the state of that, and how did that story come about?
Well, I pitched that story, and the reason I like EV stories is because they're so complex. They're complex, and they're also not. I mean, a lot of people are buying EVs. I think the absorption rate is now, I think it's up to getting 5% in Ontario, over 7% now in BC, probably higher. But everybody seems to be talking about EVs. And yet the world of electric vehicles has so many different angles and aspects and tentacles. And so I really love those complex stories that have a lot of moving parts and different avenues to explore. And I really enjoy trying to find a way to bring in as much of those aspects together in a coherent whole. And then in the case of television, to make it visually compelling. So I feel like EV stories have all of that. So the challenge with EVs is multiple-fold. From a technical point of view, there is what that story alluded to, which is range anxiety, which is this idea of, okay, so if I buy an EV, am I going to be able to drive 300 kilometers and find a charging station? And so what is it going to take to get those charging stations? And are EVs going to soar unless we have charging stations? So that's one of the chicken and eggs problems. But we're starting to see policy move in the direction of really tough vehicle emission standards in the US and mandates for EV sales in Canada. So you're going to see more and more EVs, and sort of that chicken and egg problem is going to become less so. The other reason I like EV stories is that there is a lot of, if I can call it that, misinformation around electric vehicles. And as an expert in climate change communication, I always like tackling these misinformation gremlins. So one of the pieces of misinformation around EVs is that, oh, well, you know, they're not really that efficient or helpful for the environment because it takes a lot of energy to produce EVs. And what if your electricity is coming from fossil fuels? Well, then it all balances itself out, and it doesn't really provide a benefit, and it's just a fad. And so I didn't really get into so much detail in that story, but that was one of the things that I really wanted to look into. And the research clearly shows that even in places where electricity comes from fossil fuels, like, you know, West Virginia, for example, where it's coal, even in those states, even in those places, the benefits of EVs in terms of overall CO2 reductions over the lifespan of the EV are significantly better than for an internal combustion engine. So it's not an accurate, it's a myth to say that EVs don't have important carbon reduction benefits. And that's important to know. Again, that's one of those basic facts that's important to know, because transportation is the second major source of emissions in Canada after oil and gas. So I feel like people should know that.
So we reached out to faculty and students, and they had questions for you. Some of them you were going to speak about, actually. So one of the first ones was about pitching a climate story. So I think, how do you do that? Oh, hey, I'm back. All right. And so there's a lot of questions, because it is an enterprise and investigative kind of field that you're in to do this kind of reporting. It can be really intimidating, I'm sure, for our students. So what would be your pathways to getting them to start their first climate story?
Okay, well, I hate to disappoint you with this answer, but the pitch for a good climate story is like a pitch for any other good old-fashioned news story. And the answer is the story. I always like to look for the story, the people at the center of the story, your characters. How does this story meet people where they're at? How does it connect with people where they live? Does it affect them on a day-to-day basis in their lives? It's one of the reasons I like EV stories, because it affects us. Climate stories can be very inaccessible. They're about abstract concepts like CO2 levels, or 1.5 degrees of warming, or millimeters of sea level rise. But if they're all of a sudden about how your favorite boardwalk is going to be flooded in a king tide, and what the city's doing about that, that's a more interesting story. So I always like to look, like any good journalist, you want to look at people, the characters. How does this affect the people you're writing about, the communities that you're working on? And coming from the world of TV, also looking for those really visual stories. So heat waves, for example, can sometimes be hard to capture visually. Heat doesn't look necessarily good on TV. So finding creative ways to do visual stories. But I think it ultimately begins with how it affects people where they live in their communities. And I mean, again, just to repeat something I said earlier, I think the best climate change story, and I know this is kind of counterintuitive, but bear with me, I really believe the best climate change story is not even a climate change story. So we talked about urban planning, for example. That might not seem like a climate change story on the surface, but in a way it is, because we're talking about making cities more walkable and the air more clean. So it's not necessarily your typical climate change story about the UN's latest IPCC report, but it does have implications about climate.
Right, that makes sense. Kevin, don't have much more time left. We're almost near the end of our session, but Kevin, do you have another question from the pile that we have? I'm talking to our producer, Kevin. It's one of our students here. Okay, so what are key questions reporters should consider when covering climate change issues?
Oh, great. Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so I've got 3 points on this. And number one, are you being faithful to the facts? So as I alluded to earlier, there's been this tendency to shy away from the blunt, honest truth about climate change because we think it's going to scare people with doom and gloom. But as we talked about in terms of the 97% thing, people need basic facts about climate change. They need to understand that the climate crisis comes from burning fossil fuels and energy, where we get our energy. So are you, like any good journalist, being faithful to the facts? That's the first thing. The second thing is, are you showing instead of telling? Which again is something that any good journalist should do. So in academic terms, this is called a descriptive social norm. So showing examples of ordinary people like you, where you live, taking climate action where they live, that are doable, enjoyable, beneficial, bringing people together. So again, featuring people in your stories who are part of cycling networks, or showing visuals of people commuting to work, on their bicycle, even if it's for a random story about something else. So showing rather than telling, giving visual examples and descriptions of how people are responding, ordinary people are responding to the climate crisis. And the last thing, which something I really emphasized in this talk, is, are you looking at the problem at a system level? So again, it might seem that climate change is something that any one person can fix with changing their light bulbs or recycling, or that it's just a scientific problem. But at the core, climate change is a problem of politics and economics. We've got to change the way we produce energy. So we've got to stop burning stuff and start using cleaner forms of energy. And we've got to tap into that notion and that system level aspect of the problem. If all we do is focus on gee whiz, techno-optimistic solutions and carbon calculators, then we're not really getting at the system level change. And so that's the third thing. So just to summarize, number one, be faithful to the facts. Number two, show rather than tell. And number three, go under the hood and look at the problem at a system level. Bring out the context out of the background and into center stage.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kamyar, for joining us. Before we go, you should probably plug your story today. It's Nature Economy, right?
Yes, I did a story that just got published today, which was a slow burn. But
globalnews.ca for everyone.
Globalnews.ca, right on the front page this morning, probably not there by now. But it's this kind of counterintuitive and provocative idea that protecting nature in the form of old growth trees in BC, that was kind of my character, if you will, that protecting old growth trees is in and of itself a form of economic development. That if you leave nature standing, you can make money off of that. Because the current model is, let's exploit nature, let's drill for oil or mine for minerals or whatever, and deal with the mess after. But I wanted to write a story about this idea that just keeping nature untouched is a form of economic activity in some communities, and can we scale this? And that was the story that I did today.
Okay, great. Definitely, we should check that out. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this edition of In Conversation. And I'm going to throw it back to our chair of the School of Media, Tina Cortez.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Robert. Once again, this month, you have guided us, taken us deeper into the conversation about climate change. Remember, this is Earth Month. Invest in our planet. Now, stay tuned. The next In Conversation is coming up in May. More details to come about that. And from all of us at the School of Media at Seneca Polytechnic, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.